Do you ever wonder if your shadow truly follows you? This unsettling thought first crept into my mind one cloudy autumn evening. As I walked down the deserted streets of my neighborhood, I noticed something peculiar. My shadow seemed to have a mind of its own. My name is Richard, and what I'm about to share with you has haunted me every day since it began. It started innocently enough, just small, almost imperceptible oddities, but it quickly escalated into a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. It was a cold Tuesday evening, and I had just left the office. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. I noticed my shadow stretching out before me, longer than usual. As I walked, I felt a strange sensation, a chill that wasn't entirely due to the cool air. I glanced down and saw it, a slight lag in my shadow's movements. When I stopped, it continued for a fraction of a second before freezing in place. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light or my tired eyes playing games with me, but the feeling lingered, a gnawing unease that I couldn't shake off. I hurried home, desperate to escape the eerie sensation. Days passed, and I tried to forget the incident, but the shadow's odd behavior persisted and became more pronounced. One evening, as I sat in my living room, the dim light from the lamp casting soft shadows around me, I saw it again. My shadow on the wall didn't quite match my movements. It seemed delayed, like an old film reel running a fraction of a second behind. I waved my hand experimentally, and the shadow responded a moment later. My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't my imagination. Something was wrong. Determined to find an explanation, I scoured the internet for similar experiences. I found forums discussing shadow people and paranormal activities, but none of it seemed to fit my situation. I wasn't seeing shadowy figures. My own shadow was acting out of sync. I confided in my friend, Mark, hoping for some logical explanation. Mark was a pragmatic guy, always able to debunk the supernatural with science. He suggested I see a doctor, thinking it might be a neurological issue. Reluctantly, I agreed. The doctor conducted a series of tests, but everything came back normal. There was no sign of any condition that could explain the lag in my shadow. I was healthy, physically and mentally, but the doctor's reassurances did nothing to ease my growing fear. Everywhere I went, my shadow followed, but not quite. It felt like something was watching me, mimicking my movements imperfectly, waiting for the right moment to do something unspeakable. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. The streets were empty, and the silence was comforting at first, but then I noticed it. My shadow, cast by the streetlights, wasn't just lagging, it was moving differently, independently. I stopped dead in my tracks, watching in horror as my shadow turned to face me. It seemed to ripple and distort, its edges becoming fuzzy. I blinked, hoping it was a hallucination, but it was real. My shadow stepped forward, a dark, featureless silhouette reaching towards me. Panicked, I ran, but no matter how fast I moved, the shadow kept pace, always a step behind, always just out of sync. I could hear my own breath, ragged and terrified, as I sprinted home and slammed the door behind me. I barely slept that night, every creak of the house making my heart race. The next day, I noticed my shadow's behavior had changed again. It was subtle, but now it seemed to be anticipating my movements, almost as if it knew what I was going to do before I did it. I became paranoid, avoiding well-lit areas, drawing the curtains in my apartment, and keeping lights off as much as possible. But no matter what I did, the shadow was always there, lurking, watching. Desperation drove me to seek out more obscure sources of information. I found an old book on folklore and superstitions at a second-hand bookstore. It contained tales of shadows coming to life, of beings that lived within our own reflections, waiting for the right moment to take over. One story, in particular, caught my eye. It spoke of a shadow that, once untethered from its owner, would seek to replace them, to become the real person while the original was trapped in the shadow realm. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront my shadow. I set up a camera in my living room, recording myself in the dim light. As I moved, I saw it again, the shadow's eerie delay, its independent actions. Gathering my courage, I spoke to it. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. To my horror, the shadow responded. Its movements became more defined, more purposeful. It raised its arm, pointing at me, and then at the floor. I looked down and saw a dark stain spreading across the carpet. I backed away, but the shadow advanced, its shape growing more solid, more menacing. I realized then that the shadow wanted to take my place. It had been slowly siphoning my essence, growing stronger while I weakened. I felt a cold, suffocating dread. I couldn't let it succeed. I had to fight back. In a moment of clarity, I remembered a passage from the book about using mirrors to trap malevolent shadows. I rushed to my bedroom, grabbing the largest mirror I could find. I positioned it in front of the shadow, hoping it would work. The shadow hesitated, then lunged at the mirror. For a terrifying moment, I thought it had failed, but then, the shadow seemed to struggle, its form distorting and shrinking as if being sucked into the mirror's surface. The room fell silent. The shadow was gone, trapped within the mirror. I stared at my reflection, half expecting it to move on its own, but it stayed still, mimicking my movements perfectly. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. The dark stain on the carpet remained, a grim reminder of how close I had come to losing myself. I decided to keep the mirror, sealing it in a heavy wooden frame and hiding it away in my attic. Weeks passed, and my life slowly returned to normal. I tried to forget the horrors I had faced, but one evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. The mirror in my bathroom, my reflection seemed different. It was subtle, but there was a delay, a fraction of a second too long. My heart pounded as I realized the truth. The shadow in the mirror wasn't gone. It had found a new home. I was never truly free. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The shadow had tricked me. By focusing on the large mirror, I had let my guard down, allowing it to infect other reflective surfaces in my home. It was a parasite, and it was spreading. I knew I couldn't live like this, constantly fearing my own reflection. I had to find a way to banish the shadow for good, but how? The book had offered no solution beyond trapping the shadow. It was up to me to find a way. I decided to destroy every mirror in my house, every reflective surface that could harbor the shadow. It was a drastic measure, but I was desperate. I gathered all the mirrors, glass objects, and anything shiny, piling them in the backyard. With a sledgehammer, I shattered them one by one, shards flying everywhere. It was cathartic, a release of all the pent-up fear and frustration. As the last mirror broke, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was done. Life without mirrors was odd at first. Shaving, getting dressed, even simple tasks like brushing my teeth became challenges. But I adapted. The house felt safer, less oppressive. The shadows seemed to behave normally again, always in sync with my movements. I hoped it was over, that I had finally rid myself of the malevolent shadow, but deep down, a part of me remained wary, always watching, always waiting for the next sign of its return. One day, months later, I received a package. No return address, no sender. Curious, I opened it and found an old, ornate mirror. There was a note attached. For Richard, may you always see the truth. My hands trembled as I stared at the mirror. I didn't know who had sent it or why, but I couldn't bring myself to hang it up. Instead, I locked it in the attic with the other one, hoping it would stay there. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers from the attic, faint and distant, and I wonder if the shadow is still there, waiting for the right moment to return and claim what it believes is rightfully its own. Determined to put the past behind me, I moved to a new town, far from the haunting memories. My new apartment had no mirrors, no reflective surfaces. It felt like a fresh start, a way to escape the shadow's grasp. For a while, things seemed better. I made new friends, started a new job, and even began to feel like my old self again. But the fear never completely left. Every time I saw reflection, even in a puddle or a shop window, I felt a pang of anxiety. One evening, as I walked home from work, I passed a small antique shop. Something in the window caught my eye, a familiar ornate mirror, identical to the one I had locked in the attic. My heart raced as I stepped inside the shop. The shopkeeper, an old man with a kindly face, greeted me. "Ah, you've noticed the mirror. It's a rare piece, very old. Where did you get it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It was sold to me by a collector," he replied. "Quite a story behind it. They say it's haunted." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Haunted? Yes, legends say it traps the souls of those who look into it. I bought the mirror, feeling a mix of dread and determination. I had to find out if it was the same one, if my shadow was still trapped inside. At home, I carefully unwrapped the mirror and placed it on the floor. Taking a deep breath, I looked into it. My reflection stared back, perfectly in sync. Relief washed over me. Maybe it wasn't the same mirror after all. But as I turned to walk away, I saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of the glass. I turned back, my heart pounding. The shadow was there, faint but unmistakable, moving independently of me. Panic set in. I knew I had to act quickly. I remembered a ritual from the old book, a way to banish the shadow once and for all. I gathered the necessary items, candles, salt, and a piece of black cloth. Following the instructions from the book, I drew a circle of salt around the mirror and lit the candles. I covered the mirror with the black cloth and began to chant the incantation, my voice shaking. The air grew cold, and the candles flickered. I felt a presence, a dark, oppressive force. The shadow was fighting back, resisting the ritual. I continued to chant, pouring all my fear and anger into the words. Suddenly, the candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. The mirror rattled, and I heard a low, guttural growl. I kept chanting, refusing to give up. With a final, desperate shout, I finished the incantation. The room fell silent, the oppressive presence lifted, and the air grew warm again. I removed the cloth and looked into the mirror. My reflection stared back, perfectly normal. The shadow was gone. Exhausted but relieved, I collapsed onto the floor. It was over. The shadow was truly gone this time. I kept the mirror, not as a reminder of the horrors I had faced, but as a symbol of my victory. Life slowly returned to normal. I no longer feared my reflection, no longer felt the oppressive presence of the shadow, but I would never forget the ordeal I had endured. One evening, months later, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find a young woman standing there, looking nervous. "Are you Richard?" she asked. "Yes, can I help you?" "I found this," she said, holding out a small, ornate mirror. "I think it's yours." My heart sank as I took the mirror. It was identical to the one I had banished the shadow from. "Where did you find this?" "It was in my grandmother's attic. She always said it was cursed. I thought you might know what to do with it." As I held the mirror, I felt a cold dread wash over me. The shadow wasn't gone. It had found a new victim, a new mirror. I had to act quickly before it could harm anyone else. I invited the woman inside and told her everything. She listened, her eyes wide with fear. Together, we performed the ritual again, banishing the shadow from her mirror. But the shadow was stronger this time, more resistant. It fought back fiercely, and I felt its malevolent presence pressing down on us. We continued to chant, refusing to give in. With a final, desperate effort, we completed the ritual. The mirror shattered, and the shadow let out a terrifying scream before disappearing. The woman thanked me and left, relieved to be free of the shadow's curse. I was exhausted but satisfied. The shadow was gone for good this time. Or so I hoped. Despite the victory, a part of me remained wary. Shadows were everywhere, a constant presence in our lives. And I knew that somewhere, out there, the shadow could still be lurking, waiting for the right moment to return. Do you ever wonder if your shadow truly follows you? I do, and it's a question that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more supernatural ghost stories and horror tales.